Well, good evening, everybody, and a warm welcome to those of you who are here and to those of us already joining us online. I can see the numbers ticking up in the vestry there. Lovely to have you with us too for this 12th session in Barbara's Bible story. So welcome back, Barbara.
Thank you.
I do know poor Barbara is still struggling with a bit of a cough, so we might just have to let her get her voice occasionally during the lecture, but don't panic about it, don't worry, we will be patient.
I'm not germy, I'm just coughing.
Just coffee, yeah. All right. Well, without further ado, over to you, Barbara.
Thank you. Well, in this 12th session, remember we enjoyed last time the stories of King David's spectacular triumphs during the first 20 years of his reign. He had unified all the Canaanite states with the 12 Israelite tribes under the God Yahweh and acquired the city of Jerusalem to be its capital. More than that, David's army under Joab had gained the advantage over the Philistines and forced them to retreat to the coastal strip of Gaza. The secret of iron smelting became theirs, and they were now dominant in the region. Jerusalem provided the sophisticated administration center for this new kingdom, with its scribes writing in their own language, which we now know as Hebrew. The Ark of the Covenant was installed in Jerusalem in the dual care of Zadok, the priest of Jerusalem, and the Israelite priest Abiathar from Anathoth. A new temple for Yahweh was planned, but didn't get built until the next reign. No doubt Zadok and Nathan kept a low profile at first, while they waited to see how matters would develop. But as they gained confidence in David, they reasserted themselves and their own Jerusalem styles of worship, with its Canaanite rituals and music, even though now they were all dedicated to Yahweh. King David became a priest king, Canaanite style, and took his place in the old Canaanite New Year festival. Because there's a note, you never, never, never take away people's parties. They like their parties, and if you take them away, they're going to resent it terribly. St. Augustine at Canterbury realised this when he came and altered the date of Christmas. So the people in his area, used to a grand celebration in December, could have their grand celebration, but remember the birth of Jesus rather than the birth of an old Roman god. So the whole principle is right. You don't take away people's parties, you assimilate them into a new modus vivendi. Zadok, no doubt, looked much more splendid in his robes than Abiathar, the priest from the country. Finally, a new covenant had been established with the help of the Nathan the prophet, ensuring the continuity of David's descendants as the future kings of Jerusalem. All seemed perfect, the records being kept for the first time by contemporary secretaries. But do remember, these original records have been edited and re-edited many times by priests and prophets over the years, turning real history into sacred history, and thus giving us scripturally God's story of King David. But all people are human and less than perfect, including the king. What was David like as a man? Was he really an ardent champion of Yahweh, or a pragmatic worshipper of a useful God because he was the winner? Well, we must seek some clues. We already have his family background, and his personal loyalty to Saul and Jonathan to speak in his favour, and the loyalty of his own family and thousands of his troops, and many others all speaking in his favour. We know he was a musician and a poet, with Psalm 23 being the classical example of his personal devotion to Yahweh. But how important to him were the stories of all the Israelite patriarchs and Moses? We may well also ask, how important to him was Yahweh's covenant and law established at Mount Sinai? It's difficult to know, because all the written accounts were made by the scribes of Jerusalem, to whom these questions are just not important. Today, however, we'll examine a very different piece of writing, now incorporated into the book of 2 Samuel in chapters 11 to 20 and 1 Kings chapters 1 to 3. It's known as the Court Chronicle, written by an insider in the palace, a journalistic mole who gives us a very different picture of David as he grew older and began to decline. It was first identified in the 1970s by the German scholar Martin Noth. He traced its survival through the later prophetic writings, but not the priestly writings of Chronicles. It's the subtle story of how the Jerusalem leaders worked out their revenge on David for capturing their city. They managed in the end to put their own man on the throne. Now, let's go on. Sorry. We are inside the palace for the rest of this session. There was no photographer. So, sorry, no pictures. But please let your imaginations get to work and visualize the stories for yourselves. And you'll have a wonderful time. The Court Chronicle begins with the situation of David so secure on his throne that he didn't need to lead his army into battle himself. He left all that to his well-tried commander, Joab, who had obviously become a trusted friend over the years. While Joab began the spring offensive against the Ammonites, David remained in Jerusalem, presumably in the cedarwood palace at the top of the Ophel hill, overlooking all the lower houses built on the steep hillside. On one occasion, he looked downwards and spotted a very beautiful woman washing herself on the roof of her house. Her name was Bathsheba. David sent for her, and she came. We do not know whether she came willingly or not, but David seduced her and made her pregnant. And this was very embarrassing, because her husband Uriah the Hittite was fighting in the army under Joab's command. And David, I'm afraid, behaved in a very unkingly way. First, he sent to Joab to ask him to send Uriah home. And on arrival, David asked for all the latest news from the battlefield, and then sent Uriah to his home for the night, supposing he would enjoy time with his wife and all would be well. The Uriah, however, being a very loyal soldier, did not go home to the luxury of his wife, but stayed at the palace until he could go back to the battlefield. Thwarted, David next made sure he was drunk the next evening, hoping that that would persuade him to go home to his wife. But no. Uriah did not go home. In desperation, David sent him back to the battlefield with a message to Joab to make sure that in the next battle, Uriah would be in great danger of being killed. Joab obeyed, and Uriah died. When David heard the news, he sent for Bathsheba, and after mourning her husband, she lived with him in his harem from then on. Nathan the prophet and chief advisor to David took his life in his hands and went to David and dared to reprove him. Sensibly, he went with a story of injustice. A rich man, owner of many sheep, had a visitor. But instead of using one of his own sheep for the banquet, he stole the one and only precious sheep belonging to a poor man. David, with all his usual sense of justice, condemned the rich man, and Nathan had the courage to tell the king that the rich man of the story was himself. The next few minutes must have seemed like an age. Would Nathan live or die? Well, it's a great tribute to David that he realized the truth, and Nathan lived. He continued to warn David that autocratic behavior by the king would inevitably bring disastrous consequences for the future. And the first disaster was the death of Bathsheba's baby. In the course of time, however, she had a second son who was named Solomon. And so ends the first of 4 insider stories in this court chronicle. The next story reveals the greatest flaw in David's character. He was an overindulgent father to his many children who grew up in idle luxury with nothing particular to do with their time. All half-brothers and sisters who had one big question hanging over their lives. Which of them would be the next king? David failed to designate one of his sons because he couldn't bear to say no to any of them for this privilege. And tensions continued to grow as he got older. Before that became a big issue, however, we have the second story, which caused great distress in David's family. As the children grew up in their idleness, they began to fall in love for want of something to do. And we meet Prince Absalom and his beautiful sister Tamar. The eldest of David's sons, Prince Amnon, fell in love with his half-sister, so much so that he became ill in his despair. His friend Jonadab thought of an idea and suggested that Amnon should take to his bed, and when his father came to visit him, he should ask for Tamar to nurse him. David couldn't say no, indulgent father that he was. So Tamar went to cook for him, hoping to encourage him to eat. Amnon persuaded her to feed him while he was in bed. But as soon as he could dismiss the servants, he seized and raped her, in spite of all her objections. Then, as often happens in such cases, Amnon's guilt led to him loathing the sight of Aunt Tamar, and he had her thrown out of his rooms with orders that the doors should be bolted against her. The disgraced Tamar was distraught and full of tears. Her brother Absalom found her, realized what had happened, and took her under his protection. When David heard what had happened, he was angry, but, and I quote from the chronicler himself, David would not punish his son because he loved him, for he was his firstborn. Absalom's frustration turned to hatred for his brother, and he waited for an opportunity to get his revenge for Tamar. And too long And 2 long years went by before the opportunity presented itself. There was to be a big party for the sheep shearing festival in the area of Ephraim. Absalom tried to persuade his father to attend, but David declined. He did, however, give permission for all his sons to go to the feast. And Absalom suddenly saw his opportunity for revenge at last. He ordered his servants to make sure that Amnon got drunk. And then he ordered them to kill Amnon, assuring them that he would take the blame. Well, the feast was interrupted by the murder most foul. And in the fear of what else might happen, all of David's sons who were there left in a panic and rode away as fast as their mules could carry them. The panic was so great that when the news of it reached David, he was told that all his sons had been killed. It was Jonadab who realized that the incident was no more than Absalom's personal revenge on Amnon for the disgrace of his sister. And it was soon confirmed when all David's other sons arrived home safely. Absalom, of course, didn't dare come home. He fled for safety far from Jerusalem. And that could have been the last we heard of him. But no. Soon it became apparent to everyone that while David could do nothing about the loss of Amnon, he was now yearning for his lost son, Absalom, because of his fatherly love for the young man. Only faithful Joab could intervene. He found a wise woman to go to the king with a petition, a fabricated story of a widow whose 2 sons had quarrelled and one was killed. So the other one fled, leaving the grieving mother mourning the loss of both her sons. David responded as Joab guessed he would, granting mercy to her remaining son. She then admitted her story was really about the king's lost son. And suddenly David realized that Joab was behind this whole story and gave in gratefully to his best friend. He sent Joab to find Absalom and bring him back to Jerusalem. He was, however, to be confined to his own quarters and banned from the presence of the king. 2 years went by and nothing changed. Eventually, this extraordinarily handsome young man ran out of patience. He summoned Joab to come to him. But Joab didn't take orders from the likes of him. And when he refused to come a second time, Absalom gave orders for Joab's barley field to be set on fire. That brought him. Joab capitulated, came to Absalom, and heard his complaint that he could have remained in exile more happily than he was living in Jerusalem. Joab went to the king and told him. The indulgent father sent for his son, and there was a happy reconciliation. We are left to imagine what Joab thought about the young Prince Absalom as this second story comes to an end. The third story again involves the very handsome Prince Absalom. He decided to assert himself in the still unanswered question, who would be David's successor on the throne? He decided to promote himself. He was handsome enough to command people's attention, but he needed their approval in more kingly ways. First, he established himself in their sight. They would often see him standing in a chariot and attended by 50 outriders, stationing himself near the city gate. And there he would meet petitioners coming in from the country and to see the king and hear his judgments. He began to help them. He made the judgments for them himself and began to steal the hearts of the people. 4 years later, he petitioned his father for permission to go to Hebron, the major city of the tribe of Judah. While away from home, but in the heartlands of his own tribe, he sent secret messengers everywhere, plotting to have trumpets blown to announce himself as the new king at Hebron. Well, this took everyone by surprise. But the conspiracy took hold, and Absalom gained more and more enthusiastic followers. The uprising was so severe that David realized his own danger and fled from the city of Jerusalem. He fled together with all his household, apart from 10 concubines who were there to look after the palace. All the king's guardsmen in Jerusalem went too, as also did Abiathar and Zadok, the priests. They even took the Ark of the Covenant with them, but David commanded that they returned it to Jerusalem. David fled across the Kidron Valley and climbed the Mount of Olives in distress. He plotted with his friend Hushai to keep in touch with those still loyal to him in Jerusalem. He then left just in time before Absalom swept into the city and took possession of Jerusalem. Well, in Jerusalem, David's loyal friend Hushai pretended to swear loyalty to Absalom, although Absalom at the time favoured the counsel of his friend Ahithophel. Ahithophel advised him to consolidate his position in Jerusalem by going to the palace and making himself master of David's harem. Next, Ahithophel begged to go after David with a sizable army and kill him. But Absalom listened to the counsel of the treacherous Hushai, who sent word to David telling him to go further away from danger. And in the despair of being rejected, Ahithophel went home and hanged himself, leaving Absalom in danger. Far away, David's troops were rallying to him again, and he divided them into 3 companies, one under the command of Joab, another under Joab's nephew, Abishai, and the third under a man called Ittai. David wanted to lead them himself, but was persuaded not to do so. He therefore waved them off with a pathetic injunction. I quote, "To deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom." One can only imagine what Joab thought of that. The battle finally took place in the uncomfortable forest land of Ephraim, and it was recorded that the forest claimed more victims that day even than the sword. Absalom himself was a victim. While riding his mule, his head became entangled with the low branches of a tree, and he was dragged out of his saddle and left hanging helplessly from the tree. When Joab heard, he rounded on the messenger for not killing Absalom while he'd had the chance. Joab said he would have been well rewarded with 10 pieces of silver and a new belt. But the messenger had remembered David's word to them all, to deal gently with the young man. Joab's patience ran out. He decided to waste no more time. He himself took a handful of spears and thrust them into the dangling victim in the tree. Others joined in then, and Absalom was well and truly killed. Joab then had a problem. How to tell David, whom he'd always served so loyally? 2 messengers were dispatched, the first to say that there was news, and the second to tell the king that all his enemies had been defeated. And the aging, devoted father was overcome with grief, as expected, weeping and crying. And I quote, "Oh, Absalom, my son! Oh, Absalom, my son, my son! Would that I had died instead of you, my son, my son." When David continued in deep mourning, Joab was cross. He was cross that David had gone into deep mourning, leaving the troops to think that the victory they had won for David was all a big mistake. David continued in his unhappiness and made no move to thank his soldiers for his deliverance. Joab took David to task again and warned him if he didn't personally thank them for their victory, restoring him to his throne in Jerusalem, they would become so disillusioned with him that he would lose their loyalty. Joab's advice won the day. David did thank all the soldiers, the soldiers, the priests, messengers, and all the people. But he dismissed Joab and appointed a man called Amasa in his place. Well, in the end, David was restored to his throne and took charge in Jerusalem as before. The rebellion was over, and David was merciful to those who had supported Absalom. It was, however, not the last rebellion. More followed, and Joab was instrumental in quelling them. It seems that Amasa had failed in his new role, because we find Joab once again taking control of David's army. Those who wrote of these events identified themselves at the end of this story as Jehoshaphat the recorder, Sheva the secretary, together with the priests Zadok and Abiathar. There was one other signatory which raises eyebrows, and that is mention also of Adoram, who was in charge of the forced labour. Times were obviously changing as David declined into old age and ill health. Well, the 4th story in the Chronicle was added later and can be read in the first 3 chapters of the first book of Kings. This story is sometimes called the Jerusalem plot. It takes place inside the palace, with no communications allowed outside. Inside the palace, then, where King David was sadly declining more and more. Those caring for him couldn't even keep him warm. So they tried desperate measures to rouse him. They found him a beautiful new nurse. But in spite of her beauty, David's sexual interest failed him, and everyone knew his end was not far off. The perpetual question of which of his sons would succeed him on the throne had still not been resolved. The future hung in the balance, especially for all the important people who worked in Jerusalem, but who were still newcomers to the traditions of Israel. And there was no guarantee for their well-being in the future. Another of David's sons, Prince Adonijah, was the next to make a move and decided to make a personal bid to solve the question to his own advantage. He was the next oldest to Absalom, very handsome, and he secured the backing of Joab, because of his record of behaviour had always been exemplary. He made his bid to be hailed as the new king of Israel. He gained the influential support of Joab, and then invited his brothers and all the officials of Judah to a big sacrifice at En Rogel. But he made sure he didn't involve anyone of the Jerusalem elite. Not Nathan, not Zadok, not Benaiah, and not David's personal guards. Well, Nathan got to hear of Adonijah's plan and realized it was time to act. He organized the plot. He warned Bathsheba of her very uncertain future with Adonijah as king, and gave advice that would save the lives not only of herself, but also of her son Solomon. Presumably, she did so with enthusiasm. And she went into the king's presence and did exactly as Nathan told her. She reminded David of his promise made years ago that Solomon would be the next king, and told him the news about Adonijah's bid for power. As planned, Nathan then entered the royal bedroom and corroborated what Bathsheba had said. He told David of Joab's defection in favor of Adonijah to become king, and asked David if he'd commissioned this, telling him how Adonijah had been proclaimed king, while completely ignoring his brother Solomon, who hadn't even been invited to join him. David bowed to the combined pressure of Nathan and Bathsheba, and assured them that yes, it was indeed his will, as they said, that Solomon should be his next successor. Bathsheba was thrilled, because she herself would become the new First Lady, as the Queen Mother, be a very important person in the palace. And even more so when David sent for Zadok, and in the presence of him, Nathan and Benaiah, David commanded that they take Solomon to the Gihon spring and anoint him, and proclaim him king there, to be the next king of Israel. Then they were to return and install him actually sitting on the throne. And it happened. Success! The Jerusalem plotters had succeeded, and all while Adonijah and Joab were far away. They wasted no time, and Solomon was anointed by Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet, to quote George Frederick Handel, and proclaimed king in Jerusalem, even before David had even died. Adonijah and Joab heard the news and realized that they had been outwitted. They and all their followers quickly dispersed to save their own skins. Adonijah claimed sanctuary by grabbing hold of the horns of the altar while he pleaded for his life. King Solomon granted him mercy and sent him away. Eventually, King David was at the point of death, and the Jerusalem set ensured that his death was managed according to their customs, recording his last will, spoken and written later. He commanded Solomon to obey his wishes, that all his loyal servants, including Joab, should survive him in safety. Inside the palace, David eventually died, but the news was kept secret while Solomon consolidated himself in power. The new king began his reign by ignoring the wishes of his father. And soon both his brother Adonijah and Joab were killed by Benaiah. Joab even in the tent of meeting in front of the Ark of the Covenant. Solomon's next move was to appoint Benaiah as head of the whole army instead of Joab. And then he appointed Zadok as sole priest of Yahweh in Jerusalem. And all this before the people heard that King David had died. The palace coup had succeeded. They had ensured that the new king was one of their own, born of a Jerusalem mother, brought up differently from all the others of David's sons, and they had rid themselves of all David's loyal servants. At last, they had their revenge for the capture and takeover of their city by David so many years before. The chronicler was so proud of Jerusalem's new King Solomon that the last chapter of the Chronicle begins very proudly, announcing that he was held in such high esteem by neighbouring countries that he was offered to make a very prestigious marriage with a princess of Egypt, no less. The Chronicle ends with a delightful story. It describes Solomon as a very sincere follower of Yahweh, so much so that in a dream, Yahweh made him a promise to give him whatever gift he asked for. Solomon, very creditably, asked for an understanding mind with which to govern the people, always discerning between good and evil in his judgments. It's followed by the story of his judgment between two women, who both claimed to be the mother of one surviving baby. Solomon is reputed to have said, "Cut the baby in half and give them half each," whereupon the real mother begged him to spare the baby and even to give it to the false claimant. Solomon's reputation for wisdom became well established, but we shall get to know more of that in the future. Well, so ends the Chronicle and the reign of King David. What would the new king bring to the job of leadership in Israel? Well, we'll find out next time. Next time will be after Easter on the 1st of May, so you have a break. But I hope you'll remember to come back on the 1st of May, and we have 3 more sessions to finish off the first part of this long saga. But I wish you all a very happy Easter in the meantime, and look forward to seeing you again afterwards. Thank you for coming.